Naming and negation. 1. To name is to constitute a subject. 1.3. A subject may be a person, community, phenomena, or thing, or even a relation between them. 1.31. A preposition predicates a subject in some way. 1.311. A sentence is a kind of preposition. 1.312. Predication is a demonstration of the attributability of a subject, the expression of a subject's attributes. 1.313. An attribute can be a subject provided that we acknowledge that such a subject would be a subset of the subject. 1.32. Naming always negates from the subject in its act of predication, even in naming a subject. 1.321. A name, inasmuch as it is individuated, always negates the subject in a determinate way. 1.3211. The determination of a subject is in its name itself, particularly if the name is a predicate. 1.3212. The capacity to be named is intrinsic to every subject. 2. Naming is an act. 2.1. An act is always an act of predication. 2.12. It may be said that the act of naming produces predicates. 2.13. In which case the productivity of naming as an act is the expression and constitution of subjects. 2.14. The attributes of a subject are its modes of being in the world. 2.15. Even if the subject in itself is not finite, it is experienced within a horizon of finitude. 2.16. Negation is the inner reflection of the possibility of finitude. 2.17. This finitude itself is determinate, hence finite. 2.18. The act of naming in the finiteness of finitude is where an attribute is found. 2.19. Hegel names this the negation of the negation. Wittgenstein alludes to it too. Aesthetically, Bloch calls it the darkness of the lived moment. 2.2. Ignorance is a lack of predicates. 3. Style is a manner of being. 3.1. One may call it the enunciation of attributes. If it was not also already their negation, but we've been through that. 3.3. Attributes may be in contradiction with each other, as may subjects. 3.33. The being of negativity without predication is what is often mistaken for evil. 3.4 Name your acts. That is an ethic. 3.44 The nameability of acts is an attribute of language. 3.45 There are no rules in language, only conventions, which is why style is a manner of being. 1.4 Repetition both reinforces and dilutes, yet is also always unique in a way other than what it repeats. 1.44 Originality is a kind of style or repetition that is unique in a way that precedents can't be found for. 1.45 To name this as a digression is an act of politics, which is also a function of power. 1.5 Naming is always a function of power, even when it is used to subvert it. 2.3 To grapple with a problem is always already the invention of a problem. Perhaps it is best to think of it as a construction. 2.31 How do we construct our problems? Determine the kind of solutions we may apply. 2.32 This is never merely deductive. 3.5 So create. 3.51 Meaning, if you must call it that. 3.52 Even if it is nothing but a rhythm, it must be a rhythm that you see, hear, or feel. 3.6 Order is a kind of rhythm. By the same token, rhythm is a kind of order. This is not merely harmonic, but it could be thought of as a melody. 3.8 Thought is never not a function of memory. Then again, it is never merely that. 3.9 Hegel taught us that to think something means that we think its limits, and hence also apprehend the possibility of a beyond. Such a beyond is always predicated by it being beyond what we initially thought of. 3.95 What is negation precisely if there is nothing in reality which is not the case? Wittgenstein alludes to this problem in his Tractatus. Perhaps negation then comes to take its place as the prime task of philosophy, if only to quell illusions that we may harbor of reality. 3.96 What if, however, there is a reality to illusions, refers Zizek. 1.6. What we call an object is not what that object is. It is merely one of an infinite possible names for an object. 1.7. Naming is an act of attribution. An attribute, nonetheless, marks an identity, or rather marks identity. 1.71. An attribution of an act presupposes a subject, the one who names. 1.8. Naming functions as an index of referability for subjects. 4. Fear is the suspicion that there is a negation beyond that which one names. 4.1. In other words, it could also be read as the acknowledgement that there are others who do name. 4.2. Absolute fear is the idea that there is a negation beyond symbolization itself. 4.4. Does time negate? Hegel uses it in a constructive light. 4.5. Naming constitutes despite negation. It creates a subject in language, defines attributes, creates a world. This too is an ethic. 4.6. Yet never forget, every act of naming, every predicate negates inasmuch as it constitutes a subject which is no longer that. Ellipsis. One cannot theorize beyond a point. One needs breaks that permit a truth that isn't as sharp as exposition, with varied textures, slowness that can tease the cadence of a thought to being mellow, mellow to kinds of life out of the ordinary. However, it is precisely the ordinary where we find this. Ellipsis. It was late at night, November 2014. The early chill from the winter had just set in, and the door creaked slowly on its hinges from the wind outside. I found myself awake, woken up by what precisely I do not know, but I was dreaming. There was a gate which had appeared, and a car's headlights, and a ringing fear, just before I woke up. The room was still as it was the evening before. A wall cupboard where my books and clothes were kept, adjacent to a barricaded doorway that went up to my landlord's apartment. The stairway was so short that the space beneath it could only accommodate a shoe rack where I also kept some weights I exercised with. Wrapped up comfortably in my blanket, I wonder what had woken me. Curious enough, and too awake to head back to sleep, I got up and switched on the light. I had adopted a dog from the street outside, never named her though, and wondered if she had been scratching the door of my tiny studio. I got up and opened it. The street was still the same, placid in the night, illuminated by street lights. The narrow alley always seemed too crowded, with all the cars parked on it along the edge near the buildings. Kamla Nagar was a commercial cum residential area right beside Hansraj College, where I was studying. The wind made ripples against the dust on the roads, which I closed the door quickly to avoid. The exams were coming up, and I was probably just tense from the pressure that students like me live under. Dreams of the future diminish in proportion to the disappointments we swallow when the results are announced. And gathering my bearings, I nervously decided to open my books and sit down to work. Ellipsis. Work and faith. 5. Work. What does such a word predicate? A physicist would call it displacement created by self-activity. A technical definition to be sure. In common parlance, it is often used to refer to a task that one is paid a monetary remuneration for. A job. Yet what is it for? And who does it? 5.1. To the physicist, everything works. But that is not the same as saying everyone works, particularly taking the other definition into mind. 5.2. An economist, especially the classical political economists such as Adam Smith and David Ricardo, may subscribe to what is called a labor theory of value. The hypothesis that the source of value in trade and wealth is human labor, an intuitively true understanding. 5.3. This holds water until we take trade into account, where the scarcity of a product or service may become an essential factor to the value it may garner at a market. What is to become of labor then? 5.4. Perhaps it may morph into a form of self-expression, the act of naming, creating, negating, attributing. 5.5. What if we were speaking of an artist, however, one who composes a poem? Here, the form of self-expression is married to that of a profession. Self-expression takes on the attributes of work as it is understood socially. 5.6. Who is an artist working for? For himself, to be sure, but also to the community that is named, predicated, and created in such a work. The community of readers. 5.7. This is a function of his faith. 5.71. Faith rests on the function of identity. At its most elementary, The fact that we trust a subject to correspond with the names that we have for it. A basic referability, a correspondence. 5.72. Subjects change, however, and our understanding of them is negated. We understand a subject inasmuch as we can name the aspect of our understanding of a subject that is negated. (5.73). This is the dimension of loss. It is imminent to negation. 5.8. Wittgenstein notices a serious problem, however. This is nothing in the world that corresponds to not. There is nothing in the world that corresponds to not. Tractatus. And yet there is negation. 5.9. The example that Hegel writes is crystal clear. Writing it down alters nothing in the truth. I write that it is day. At night, it will no longer be day, and yet the truth remains in the form of a negative. Hegel cites this example to open up the dimension of the negative. 5.94. Wittgenstein calls this picture thinking, in a sense indicating that language and the word are at most representative of experience, but are they not also constitutive of it? Ellipsis. Discourse. Conversations have no internal logic to them. In that sense, they are forms which operate in the realm of freedom in the broad sense. They are, however, bound by the limitations of what a person knows and how well or clearly they are able to express it. The idea that we understand each other is an ideal that communication presents as a necessary hypothesis for correspondence to have meaning. To repeat, the idea that we understand each other is an ideal that communication presents as a necessary hypothesis for correspondence to have meaning. The study of meaning within linguistic circles is known as semantics. We pick up correlates to words slowly, naturally given the habitat that draws us and our integration and role within it. Language acquisition is never independent of how it is acquired. A master will learn how to command, a slave to obey. Roles, in this sense, predicate the kind of language that is learned. It is hence important to ask not merely what someone knows, but what they are doing. What have they been doing? What is it for? These questions frame the life world within which a discourse or language as such emerges and comes to recognize itself. The recognition of a language of itself is the point at which it becomes a discourse, the mirror stage of language itself. This moment of recognition is important to frame, for it marks a difference between spontaneous speech and a measured understanding of oneself. Language is, in fact, one of the prime levers of thought, and this does place it in a privileged position. It is the means via which sentience is expressed, the medium of communion, if you will. It calls out to a community. The one who utters this may be named a subject, and the relation between a subject and the signifier is what constitutes a discourse. Thank you.